just want to start by saying, like I am extremely tired in this pandemic, and I have just been, I feel like the pandemic is just this, like, at this point, like a co-author, a coexistence with me. And I'm gravitating much more towards the kind of texts that acknowledge that kind of embodied existence in this world. So I think that's a little bit of a shift for me, but like I need affect, I need emotion, I need some acknowledgement of bodies in this world. So these are just a few things, these are all books that I'm about halfway through, but I find that they're just registering in a different way as I think of data centers. And so I've linked these projects, that you can explore for yourself. But if you have no sense of who I am or what I've done, this will give you, I think, a general idea. I'm gravitating a little bit towards the explorations of the environmental impacts of AI as well. So we can talk about some of that if we want in the discussion. But I guess today what I was thinking about, and this is pretty conceptual, this is like really sort of kind of new, but also in the pandemic, I haven't done any field work. And so it's both new and also looking back on about 10 years worth of, data center field work and writing and thinking. And I was just thinking how so much of it relies on this kind of perpetual promise, like not just data centers, but the whole enterprise of big tech, right? And I just thought, like, that concept of the promise, as far as I know, no one has really used that as sort of the underlying, I don't know, the sort of concept to explore these things. And I just think it's really evocative. And so, of course, when we think of the promise, we more or less know what it means. But I find that when you read the definition of promise, you see that it's something like really big and binding and informs so much of how we're able to live as a collective in the world. So I don't know, for me, the promise was this new entry point in that, that helped me sort of think of the ways in which we're sort of planning these kind of futures. And so, of course, in pop culture, just to set it up, again, it's super obvious, but we do promises through gestures, like a kind of an oath or a handshake or a pinky swear, or these kind of ceremonies where we do something more official. It's also all over pop culture, Winnie the Pooh films, the Secret, which is this like a terrible kind of scam. Anyway, like the promise is just absolutely everywhere in pop culture. And yet I think that it's even in coding language like Java and other languages. So it's really interesting as sort of this premise. And so I was thinking originally to focus on data promises, but like I have a sense that this group is just like a little bit past that. So just sort of broad strokes, we have this idea of the techno fix that that basically all we need is more data. Like everything will be solved. We just need a little bit more data to figure out these big truths, and then we'll be able to like really effectively predict what's best for whoever the we is conceptualized in these sort of settler colonial fantasies of the future, I would say, in particular. And often that brings in technological innovation and environmental innovation, but by big tech sort of definitions of those things. And I think with AI, we're about to see like just another big wave of this, a pretty radical transformation of data centers, but also of those promises. And what's interesting, what I was thinking of the promise and what's changing right now is the scale of things, but it's also this idea of prediction sort of taking more of a front row. So how has the promise changed through these technologies, especially through this concept of prediction that is made, I don't know, more central in these new technological developments? So what's interesting about promises too is that they work whether you deliver on that promise. They work even if you fail to deliver on that promise. And that's what's so interesting in terms of big tech in particular. And I want to show you one example. I have a few, but maybe I'll save them for discussion. I want to show you one in particular. And then I want us to think through as a group just these different states of data center promises. And again, this is really new. So if this were to totally change or totally fall apart in discussion, I'm okay with that. But I was thinking of 4 different sort of sites or ways in which data centers make promises. And one is in rendering. And I like the word rendering because we'll see in the example I show you actual architectural renderings of plans for data centers. they offer, like, I mean, the investments in the renderings themselves are significant, but they don't need to deliver for the promise. The example I show you is they really don't need to deliver. In fact, they don't, for that promise to have been made and to do the work of a promise anyway. And then there's examples of retrofitting. Graham Pickering and others have written about retrofitting old bakeries, say, into data centers. The example that I show is in the US, using old jails and prisons to turn them into data centers. And I think there's something interesting there to be made about data extraction in the sense of Jason Moore, with the idea of, cheap nature being humans, cheap nature being data. There's something there. And then there's examples, I don't know if Julia Velikova or Jenna Burrell are here, but sort of drawn from their work about waiting as a state of promise and recovering, like kind of like recovery of potential, or as Julia put it, sort of these buildings that are like built really cheaply so you can take them back down and sort of retract on your promise. So just before the pandemic, and I'm sorry if I'm going over time, I'll be really quick. I'll just show you one example and then it's okay. Okay. So before the pandemic, I drove to one of these sites in Belagen in the north of Norway in the Arctic Circle, rented a car, and we drove up, and I wanted to see, so on the right there, you'll see the blue dot, that's the GPS of where we were looking out into this proposed site. And it's very cool to have gone kind of in person. And then I'll show you a little clip from the Wayback Machine that shows what was promised in the site. But basically we drove here, we parked, and then we looked, and it was just a beautiful field of flowers, pink and purple flowers, and there was a little airstrip for smaller planes. But this should give you sort of an idea of like what it's like when you're there. And then I'll just switch here to the preloaded video. Click here. I might talk a little bit over it. It's about 2 minutes. Just want to make sure. Can everyone hear that? Can you hear me as well?
Yeah.
Okay. So what's interesting here is also bringing in the technological innovation with the environmental innovation. And you'll see that actually the data center doesn't appear in this clip till about a minute and a half in, because it has to show you that it's this new, what James Brittle calls the new technology become you can't actually separate it. Settler colonial future visions, at least, this idea of those things being completely, fused together, the environment and the data center. What's interesting too about this particular data center is that it's supposed to look like glaciers, which is really interesting because it's in the Arctic Circle. These glaciers are more like black-brown, but sort of deny also at the same time, I would say, some of the violence is done to the land, and also the fact that the Arctic ice is melting. Anyway, I'll let you watch it, but there's also, I think, this fantasy of human, health and wellness and prosperity and like economic revival. So I'll just let you enjoy this really moving. You can skip over. You'll know what it is anyway. That's the land that I showed you earlier. There's the rendition from here. All right, so I think there's a lot to be said for that video. And I think it's actually really similar to other promises made by other data center projects, right? You kind of have to do this pitch, and increasingly you have to do a pitch that is really accounting for the environment. And what's really interesting in this sort of Scandinavian context is, of course, it's got to make life better for the humans around it in terms of that kind of healthy lifestyle that's imagined, right? And so I have kind of other examples, but I just wanted to set it up in this way as a kind of provocation for the role of the promise here. And I know there's probably a lot more to be said about that clip than, than I pulled out of it in the sense, but I would love to just sort of, maybe I'll stop sharing here. And I know that for the workshop, almost everyone who was invited was, speaking of a particular data center site. So I was hoping that when we talk about the promise, that we can look at those data centers that we are each working on, and thinking in and through sort of that concept, that idea of what's being promised. That brings, ideally for this workshop, though it's not always the case, brings in innovation with that sort of solving the ecological crisis, or accounting for it, or saying that, like, the debates, I think, in terms of the environment are always that, we know that they are, that data centers are very demanding of water and energy resources and of land. But I think there's a pitch and a promise in these things that's self-regulating, that it will sort of, at the very least, be neutral. There's a lot of that language around. So I'm just wondering if people here, I don't know who's here who works. I know that the workshop is set up for people who work at very specific data center sites, but I'm just wondering if anyone has, case studies of this, or ideas of sites where the promise is sort of, embedded in the project in this way.